Welcome back to the Randy Wilson Podcast. I'm here with my co-host, Dr. Tiffany Jana. This is Season 2, Episode 21. We're definitely glad to be back here together today. I'm making it a conscious effort now in every show to try to wear clothing that represents local Richmond brands. So I want to shout out Minta Hill shirt today. James Harris, who's doing great work in pushing this brand across the country, is getting a lot of attention. So I definitely want to shout him out. I'm happy to see you again today, Tiffany. You have been all over since I last saw you.
Boston and New York, I think, at the least.
Yeah, can you share with us a little bit about your time in the United Nations?
Yeah, so I was representing TMI Consulting at the Hispanic Leadership Summit, which was a national summit for Hispanic and Latinx leaders and allies and people who work in that space. And it was an honor to get to be one of the early signatories for the Hispanic Promise. It's a commitment to hire, promote, and engage with Hispanic and Latinx people in the workplace. And the whole effort that they're doing, like within the United Nations, and the summit itself was about actually creating elevated empowerment opportunities and visibility and equitable opportunities for that community.
That's great. It's great to see you out there doing that. I know you had a lot of your upbringing. You had a lot of using the Spanish community, if I'm correct.
Yeah, because initially I thought it was going to be this like a little nonprofit group that got a little corner closet in the United Nations, and I thought it's cute. It's the United Nations. I'll go anyway. I had no idea that it was going to be the actual big deal rooms with the translators and everything. So it was extraordinary, and I'm asking myself, how did I get in this room? Because I was the only as I could tell, visibly African-American person in the room, besides Jesse Jackson and people who were on the panel. But I think that somebody read my book or has heard me speak to the fact that the Latinx community, Hispanic community is my heart, because I spoke Spanish first, proximity, no DNA.
Wow.
So somebody picked that up and thought that I was a worthy ally, which was amazing.
Well, that is amazing. I think it's amazing just to be able to sit back and watch and see you doing what you're doing.
Oh, man,
very impressed. Very impressed. This is, again, the Randy Wilson Podcast, co-hosted with Dr. Tiffany Jana. You can hear this podcast everywhere. However, we encourage you to go over to YouTube so that you can check us out there. Today's guest really doesn't need much of an introduction. Just in doing the research and reading up on her, she is everything to Richmond, Virginia, to history. I mean, she has done a lot of things. Just to kind of go down the list of some of her accolades, and honestly, there's not enough time in the podcast to go through them all. 2018 Richmond Power List, Arts and Culture Style Magazine. Meet the 31 People Who Are Changing the South, Time Magazine, August of 2018. 2017 Power List, again, back-to-back. Co-chair of Monument Avenue Commission, City of Richmond. That's interesting as well to learn with everything that's happening here in Richmond on Monument Avenue. It's really good to have you at this time on the podcast with everything that's just happening, because it's a very historical time right now that we're in. Honorary Doctor of Humane Letters, VCU. American Alliance Museum board member for several years. I could really keep going. Christy Coleman grew up in Williamsburg, Virginia, and earned her bachelor's and master's degree from Hampton University. She currently serves as the CEO of the American Civil War Museum, located in Richmond and Appomattox, Virginia. In her role as CEO, she has been instrumental in furthering discussion around the Civil War, its legacies, and its relevance to our lives today, not only in Richmond region, but around the nation. She began her career at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. During her time with CWF, she had increasing levels of responsibility, finally serving as Director of Historic Programs, being responsible for all programming and tours in the historic area. In 1999, she left to become President and CEO of Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History in Detroit, Michigan. In 2008, Ms. Coleman was named President and CEO of the American Civil War Center at Historic Tredegar?
Yep.
Thank you. I'm glad you recognized that I was going to mess that all up. In 2013, she helped orchestrate the merger of ACWC with the Museum of the Confederacy to create the American Civil War Museum. Christy has served on a number of local commissions and national boards. Christy strives to make museum experiences meaningful to diverse communities, a tireless advocate for the power of museums, narrative disruption, and inclusivity. I have a hard time saying that word. She has been an innovator and leader in the historic museum field. She's written numerous articles, is an accomplished screenwriter, public speaker, and has appeared on several national programs. So with all that, it's really great to have Christy Coleman on the Randy Wilson podcast with Tiffany. Jana, thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me. Yeah, that's nice.
Oh,
Well, my favorite is that Christy Coleman is also my friend.
My friend. For a long time.
For a long time, yes. Yeah, thank you so much.
how long have you known each other?
2010.
10, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Almost 10 years.
Yeah.
Just about 10 years. Actually, it has been 10 years because it
has.
was, we met through LMR
Yep.
training and all of that.
Wow, that's crazy.
So,
old decade.
yeah, I know, right?
Gosh, the time she flies. Yes. So we have CEO in common. We're both mamas and out here being people of color trying to make a change in the world.
And so it goes.
And so it goes.
Well, clearly you're doing that.
Well, you know, at the end of the day, you know, I say this often, and it's kind of become my mantra that I firmly, firmly believe that we will never get right with each other until we get the history right.
Amen.
And so in each of the places where I've worked, that has been the goal. Let's look at what the historical record says. Let's stop with the myth-making and the indoctrination and get to some critical thinking about our past, our collective past, and what that means. And so, and to do it from a point of empathy, which is probably the hardest thing because that is often misunderstood as a weakness or as a, you know, why are you even giving those people the time of day? And there's always those people to somebody else, right?
Yeah.
But really, for me, it's I got to understand where that point of potential connection is. I've got to understand where that trauma is, and I've got to understand those connective tissues, because nothing exists in a vacuum. I mean, none of it. And it's a continuum, right? And so that's been my vehicle to try to help expand the conversation and get people in a room together to consider some things that they may not have, but also to provide enough that they're familiar with that they're able to go beyond that, right? So, you know, a really good example, I guess, would be, you know, many of us from the indoctrination learned that George Washington could never tell a lie and that he had wooden teeth, right? Neither of those things are true. He's a human being. He's lying at least 10 times a day, right? Science tells us this, whether it's a little white lie or a lie of omission or whatever it is, right? So, you know, let's scrap that nonsense. But the wooden teeth thing is patently false. He had ivory teeth, and he had teeth that came from the enslaved for his false teeth. So then it becomes a slightly different conversation. And that's not to take away from the father of our country, right? You know, he held this thing together when it could have easily fell apart in at least 13 different pieces. But it does say that even in the midst of all of this conversation around freedom and liberty and justice and all of that, that black bodies were still considered disposable or parts of them. And what does that do to the psyche, not only of the people who are having that experience of being the one that's exploited, but what does that do to the mindset of those in the master class? And what does it do to their humanity in the long run? And so these are deeper conversations. And do I have the answer to those? Absolutely not. But I'm willing to raise the question. And then subsequently, you know, since I've been working in Civil War history, which is by far, I've got to tell you, the most intense of any of the historical periods that I've worked with in my career, because people feel it so passionately. And so, you know, trying to break down, well, why is that? Why do people feel so passionately or try to completely erase it from their vernacular, right? It's usually one or the other. It's very seldom in the middle, at least when I started doing this. And so, and part of it is that there's this disconnect from, again, this idea of sort of comforting myth along with, indoctrination. And the indoctrination is a direct result of the extraordinary trauma the nation faced during the time, right? So I get that. But what is so striking to me is people were like, well, my grandfather said, or my great-great-great-grandmother did this, or my people experienced that. Well, that's fine, and that's probably right. But here's the problem with that kind of assessment and using that very narrow personal memory scope. It's almost like if we tried to say 9/11 happened through my personal lens. I know exactly where I was. I know exactly what happened as I watched the towers fall. I know the panic of trying to find out if my sister in DC, especially when the plane hit the Pentagon and she was a defense contractor at the time. The fact that there was this plane headed west and nobody knew where it was, which American city was going to be next. I mean, I remember distinctly all of those moments. But that's not the story by itself. It really isn't. I just have this little small piece. But when you put the whole thing together, when you begin to understand, well, why did the Saudis and the Iraqis and the others that joined together for Al-Qaeda, why did they choose 9/11? Most Americans, I bet you, still to this day do not know the answer to that.
I don't.
Yeah, what's the answer to that?
It had to do with the splitting up of the African continent after World War I. The date matched. It was September 11th. And so, among European powers.
We up here on the podcast learning new stuff.
Right, well,
Christy
so-
Coleman, I did not know that.
I'm sitting here thinking
So,
she knows everything.
I mean,
I'm going to
they
ask her
have-
about the Bible.
I love history. So but it's tied to the carving up of Africa and from Egypt all the way to South Africa, right? And so the entire continent gets carved up and exploited even further. And so, and they are very angry about the splitting up and of the Middle East in particular. And it's a strike not just at the height of, for them, it's the height of that Western ideology. So strike at the heart of that, which is the United States, which is the World Trade Center, which is the Pentagon, which is, so they and that is not to say there's necessarily sympathy for that horrid act. Don't misunderstand. But it is part of our understanding and context. And then, as you understand the panic that was happening that day for millions of people, and then what our government and the world chose to do in those hours and days and weeks after that, has vastly shaped how we live our lives, how we travel, how we, where we can go and not, how government can surveil us or not. And so, and there is that moment. But again, if we only taught that history from, well, I was sitting in my living room, at 8:44, and then at 8:46, or that just doesn't click. That doesn't make sense. But people try to do that with the American Civil War. Well, my so-and-so was at Shiloh, and they said when they came home, right? And it doesn't work that way.
So for the people who don't know, the American Civil War Center is
A museum.
The American Civil War Museum is it's extraordinary in its telling of these histories. So the way that you're describing that context, as far as I know, there's not another museum that does what you do. Can you tell them about that perspective?
So
because I think it's fascinating.
Yeah, so as in the introduction, it said that in 2013, we merged with the Museum of the Confederate. The American Civil War Center at Historic Tredegar merged with the Museum of the Confederacy, which right off the bat, on its surface, sounds really bizarre.
Yes.
But let's be clear, the Museum of the Confederacy, while it began in 1896 as a museum to continue this, or to build out this lost cause narrative. By the 1970s and 80s, they made a deliberate decision to become a museum about the Confederacy. So it tended to be a tad more critical, really did some profound exhibitions about the role of women.
And for people who
things like
don't
that.
know the Lost Cause narrative, could you just
Sure.
couple
Lost
lines?
Cause says the Civil War wasn't over slavery, it was actually over states' rights.
Right.
And slavery really wasn't bad, it was actually a benign institution for the majority of black people, and it was a good thing. And
there are still a
that
lot of people who
the
believe this.
United States was the aggressor,
Right.
and pushing this and interrupting the Southern way of life,
Perfect, thank you.
in short. And so, but the historical record is completely blows all that away,
Right.
right? So anyway, our museum was established in 2013 by bringing together the resources of these two organizations to create something new. And our mission from the beginning is to be the preeminent center for the exploration of the American Civil War from multiple perspectives: Union and Confederacy, enslaved and free, immigrant communities, indigenous communities, men, women, children, civilians, soldiers. It is to look at the conflict the way people lived it. It is not solely a military thing. It's solely not a political thing. It's solely not social. All of it is woven together the way people experienced it. We use our temporary galleries to dig deeper into certain issues or ideas. So, for example, one of the current exhibitions that we have up is called Greenback America. The vestiges of the Civil War are in our pockets every day. And that is the U.S. bills that we carry around. We did not have a unified form of monetary policy like that prior to the Civil War. Now, yes, Alexander Hamilton establishes the National Bank and da-da-da, but most banknotes were issued by state banks. So when the federal government decides to issue banknotes to help finance the American Civil War, of course, New York bankers and insurers and all that are livid. Like, you're cutting, no, you don't do that. You know, this is what we do, and you're messing with our system, and it's going to be worthless. And then, but what ended up happening is, excuse me, people were, once it was in circulation, the ease of it, the ease of moving from one part of the country to another was extraordinary. To have stable money. So, for example, without it, if you're here in Virginia and you went to the Bank of Virginia, you would get a banknote. And if you decided you needed to go to Maryland, well, when you got to Maryland, you'd have to exchange that banknote for a Bank of Maryland note.
Traveling between countries.
Traveling between countries, right. So it just became really, so when the war is over, the United States said, well, we're going to pull in all the greenbacks. And Americans, North and South, East and West said, oh, no, we like this. We're going to keep it. So that's how we got it. So in case you're also a movie buff, this is my little trivia moment.
Oh, yeah.
If you're watching, if you love like National Treasure, that Nick Cage movie where they're, you know, and they look on the back of the bill and they say, you know, on the back of the greenback, and they say, the founding fathers left us these clues on our money. No, they didn't, because those monies weren't even established until 1863. So,
hashtag fail.
So, hashtag fail. That's one of my favorites. So, I mean, you know, clearly, I just love history, and I love the connections of it, and I'm, you know, constantly just watching and observing what's happening in the contemporary, because that drives what we talk about. And what we do. And
well, I have to thank you for, I mean, well, your leadership with the merger and the museum that has since, you know, reopened is extraordinary. So for all of our listeners and viewers who, certainly if you're in the Richmond area and you haven't been yet, you need to go, because it is not your grandpappy's museum. This is a museum that is engaging and informative for people of all ages, and because you're not, you know, trying to, you know, necessarily make a moral judgment call, you're telling the narrative from the perspective of the people who lived it. It gives you such a beautiful context to draw your own conclusions. And
it doesn't, you know, and we deliberately made sure it doesn't look like everybody else's either. So
no,
you walk in
all.
The museum, it kind of looks more like a hotel lobby versus, you know, where it's
and
relaxed and there's seating and there's multimedias, and you know, that we did this process with some of the photography, the historical photography, where we actually hired this company that does sort of digital colorization using this really fascinating algorithms and quite frankly hand talent. And so it brings life and breath to the imagery as if you're looking at a modern photography so that you can really connect with these people. So that's one of the other things that we do. And then there are narratives in there that, again, most people are unaware of. So we have the story of the woman who hides her gender. There are several women hundreds of women we think, who hid their gender so that they would fight as soldiers. And what did that do to the psychology when they found out? And at least one of those women ends up pregnant while she's in camp. And so that raises, obviously, another issue.
Whoops.
Did they know that she was a woman? Or was the assumption that this was another man and they were in a LGBTQ relationship, right? So we talk about her. We talk about, Dr. Mary Walker, who brilliant physician. She's the only woman to earn a Medal of Honor for her surgical skill in saving so many lives. And then, of course, post-war years, they want to strip her of it because you didn't win it in battle. But she saves these lives, and she said, "Well, I'm not giving it up unless you kill me."
Right.
And she didn't. But here's a woman who chose a profession that 99.9% were men, and it was so bad for her after the war and trying to establish herself in her career, is that she actually dresses as a man, and she starts identifying as Dr. M.E. Walker. She's married, she does have children as well, but her and her husband go into practice together, and most people did not know that Dr. M.E. Walker was also Dr. Mary Edwards Walker. And so there are these little tidbits of stories about people throughout the exhibition. And then, of course, we're talking about Gettysburg. Of course, we're talking about what happened at Manassas. Of course, we're talking about Vicksburg. And all of those, because, again, people lived it in this sort of integrated way. And so it is shown that way. So all of the hardcore military folks will find all the guns and knives and ships and whatever
That's
they
what
want.
blew my mind. The
Right.
last time I went, like the diversity of people who were
Right,
there and
right.
what they were interested in. You can
Right.
see people like moving through, and everyone, even if you go and you're expecting what you're expecting, like everyone is getting a little something extra that they didn't sign up
and
for.
that was the point, right?
love
That was
that.
the point. You going around the corner and you see this, Army of Northern Virginia Confederate battle flag, and yes, we have 300 different types of Confederate flags in our collection, actually close to 500. But you go and look at it and you realize that it's not just being displayed about the 47th North Carolina, but instead it is it 47th or 49? Anyway, but it's actually being displayed to tell the story of the United States colored troops who captured that flag in battle.
Nice.
So, taking these objects that we're used to seeing and then kind of flipping them on their heads to the fuller stories that they can tell.
Right.
So it's been fun. It's and it's been challenging,
Yeah.
especially
Sure.
as the conversation has moved into contemporary life.
I'm interested, Dr. Coleman. I have to say doctor now. Yeah.
Oh, no, you're not allowed to do that. I don't.
No? Look,
No, I mean, it's if I didn't matriculate, I don't choose to.
look. When
I appreciate the honors that people gave me, but I didn't matriculate to
Amazing. Congrats
doctor,
on
so.
that, by the way.
Yeah,
Thank
that's
you.
that's an honor in
Super
itself.
dope, yeah.
When Dr. Jana and I got together, we did a podcast. It was episode 15, and it's been so far the most successful podcast as far as viewers and engagement. And because of that, it contributed to conversations we were having about other people like herself that were doing good things in the community. And so we've called, we're right in the middle kind of right now of what we're calling our do-gooder series for people who are doing good things. So I'm interested in learning a little bit about what the day in the life is like for you in your role. And I'm really interested in how that and what you've done in your career has transitions out to the community for so many people in the community and so many different publications to recognize you for your work. You're obviously more than just a CEO of a museum, and I don't know what all that means. So can you share with the audience a little bit about that and what it is you've done that's gravitated all this attention?
Okay, well, as the chief executive officer, your responsibility is broad. If you are smart, which I like to think I am.
You are very smart people.
You get really, really talented people to work with you, who understand the vision, who understand the mission and are committed to that, and who have their own ideas. Now, I'm the type of leader who I like to, and I've always liked to empower and mentor. And so I encourage people, bring your ideas to the fore, work it out. If you mess up, great. What did you learn? Tell me what you learned, and let's go from there. So my day to day, the first year or two is usually just trying to get everything in alignment, really trying to establish, where the talents are, where the gaps are, and that sort of thing. It's trying to look at, obviously, you're running a public trust. So are the finances in good order? What do we need to connect better to improve the financial situation or whatever? And then for this little museum, when I came here in 2008, it was relatively new. It wasn't even 2 years old when I came. And so it was struggling to find its space. They wanted to have a national footprint, but they really hadn't connected locally. And I knew we can't go out there until we take care of home, and there are a lot of stuff going on here at home. So then it was about opening up the institution to the community and being engaged in the conversation. Now, timing is everything, because it also meant that we were leading into the 150th commemoration of the Civil War and Emancipation. So what role could we play in that conversation? What direction could we help move the conversation? And then in recent years, it's always fundraising. I mean, you're always talking to potential donors. You're always involved in one way or the other with either the generation of grants or trying to at least get your foot in the door. I answer a lot of emails every day from every possible, I would say, it feels like, let me just put it like, it feels like a third of my time is just emailing and communicating with people in a variety of ways. Now, but the work of the team really speaks for itself. And then as people were beginning to see, and I was being able to be in these public spaces, what we were trying to accomplish, the skepticism gave rise to curiosity. The curiosity, in most cases, gave rise to acceptance. And then others wanted to know, well, how do you do that? And how does that work? And again, because of the talent of the team, and especially recognizing the fact that when we merged, we have this extraordinary collection of artifacts. And so when the conversations were shifting about what do these, particularly Confederate symbols, mean in public space, the media, other researchers were coming to us because of our archival record and again our collection to try to get those answers. And so we were as transparent as possible in opening those up and actually creating portals that people could explore on their own to really see it. I mean, you can tell people 100 times a day, have you actually read the Articles of Secession? They're really clear about why they're leaving the United States and what they're protecting and doing. Have you actually, well, that doesn't mean that. No, well, yeah, it kind of does. Or have you actually read the slave narratives? Have you actually seen the pictures? These folks are telling us what happened to them. We kind of do all that. And the other part of being a CEO, in addition to the business and the sort of the vision and direction and oversight, is you're the biggest cheerleader. You gotta be. You're working with the board, and you're helping to shape the board if depending on the situation. I have been in CEO roles where boards have been appointed, and that's sort of a 50-50. But when boards are self-appointing, you can really get some extraordinary people who, again, have resources and access that help the message spread. So it really is a collective effort. But I also had a particular vision of what I thought we could be. And we did not need to, there's a saying in the museum world that's sort of taken off, particularly in the last 5 years, that museums are not neutral. And I have fought against that a little bit, because I don't think that's the right language either. Because they used to say, well, we're really objective. No, we're not. We have a responsibility because we are public trust. So from my perspective, if I see that the community in which I am working is in crisis, whether it's crisis of conscience, whether it's a need for resources, whether it's I feel it is my responsibility as a museum leader to open up the resources of the museum and say, let's have a conversation about this. This is what we have available. And fortunately, there are other remarkable leaders and institutions in this community, in the Richmond community, who have been on this journey with us as well. And so,
Is there a lot of
one of them.
Yeah.
yeah?
Bill Martin. He was
Oh,
on
Bill
here.
Martin is fantastic. I've known Bill since, oh my God, 25 years.
Is there a lot of collaboration amongst the leaders?
Yeah. We get together. We look for partnerships. We look for the alliances. We meet, quarterly, just to commiserate. I mean, sometimes it's just to commiserate, or this is what's going on, or this is what I need. And so that museum directors meeting, and actually Bill Martin is I think the genesis of that back in the day. But it's a really great atmosphere where we're all able to have these conversations in confidence so that we can figure out, okay, what can we do? What do you need? Okay, you're getting ready to unveil Kahindi Wiley.
I was going to ask you
Yeah,
about
that's
Kahindi
probably-
Wiley. I know.
I was wondering whether-
That's fantastic. Okay, what do you need, right?
Yeah. What
So,
was that
so
like
for
from
example,
your
we just
perspective?
opened
Yeah,
up.
I would really like you to speak to that, because I'm going to be
Sure.
very honest. I do not know, and I'm pretty sure that there's a lot of people in the audience that does not know everything around that at all.
Yeah, what's
So I'm here to learn.
Okay, so there are a Kahindi Wiley show retrospective was done a couple years ago at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts.
Great show.
And he's just a really provocative and wonderful artist. And around the same time was the release of the Monument Avenue Commission report when did we release that darn thing? June of 2018, July 2nd, 2018. After a year of some pretty contentious conversations that we were able, with the extraordinary help of a lot of facilitators, to help us bring these conversations to something useful where we could also share information with the public, but continue to take in their feedback. And so the commission gave three big recommendations in the course of this. The first was there is a monument that was, majority of people said, okay, if you're going to take one down, take down Jefferson Davis, and figure out how we might want to repurpose the sort of the ground architecture of that. The second piece, and the reason for that was that is the most lost cause-y of all of them. The language is up there all around it. When it was first mounted, it had, flags from all of the seceding states. It was just really something to see back in the day. And, in Latin it says we are vindicated, right? The lost cause is vindicated. So that was the one that we recommended come down. We also recommended that we had an opportunity to be additive, meaning, okay, let's also look at those people, events, stories that are critical to the life of Richmond so that we balance the landscape. The third recommendation was using the monuments that are already present, finding the language to explain their purpose and the time in which they went up. And then last but not least, so yes, there were 4. I knew there was 4. I was thinking that the other recommendation I wasn't going to talk about. But the 4th one was to engage the artistic community in creative ways. So maybe it is something that you add to something that already exists that can change the meaning. Much like how the statue of the little girl in Manhattan called she's called Fearless Girl, and it's in Wall Street, and she's facing off the bull. And it changes the power and the meaning of that thing just by the placement of this little girl. So what would happen if we placed something, or the artistic community came up with some other creative thing? So the result of that, you get of those recommendations. So I think it's called, there's like Broad Street Collective, and then the Valentine Museum and others, and VCUs, architecture schools, General Demotion, General Promotion. Yeah. There started being these exhibits and these design competitions to see what it could be. And again, those were the recommendations. So for me, the Kehinde Wiley Rumors of War is an example of turning a visual vernacular on its head, yet still remaining relatively familiar. And so, and I just think it's really terrific. And there is a certain irony that it's the land that it's sitting on, and what it's next to. There's a certain irony to that, or
Speak
poetic justice.
So where's the land that it's sitting?
So, I notice people sit out there in that area with rebel flags all the time.
Yeah, well, they protest because the
Yes.
Virginia Museum of Fine Arts, its original section was the Battle Abbey.
Right.
And then they have the Confederate chapel behind it. And so it was a soldier's home, right? And so in the, I guess the 20s or the 30s, they started flying, these Confederate battle flags out front. The more familiar, actually the Tennessee is actually more appropriate. They started hanging these flags outside, which didn't happen at the time that people, the soldiers were actually in there, because the flag protocol said you don't unfurl a battle flag if you're not in battle. It was considered disrespectful. But I digress. So these guys have been protesting because the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts a long time ago said, we're taking all of that off. We're not doing that anymore. So they expanded and the state gave that land for the creation of that museum once it was vacated and whatever. So that became our art museum. Not Battle Abbey, I'm sorry, the soldiers' home. The Battle Abbey is over Virginia Historical.
Got it. Okay.
Virginia Museum of History and Culture. I get these kind of thrown around sometimes, so forgive me for slight errors. And then immediately next door to the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts is the headquarters of the United Daughters of the Confederacy, who are the organization that is most directly responsible for all of these statuary in communities throughout the country, including in northern and western communities that these things were built. And so it is kind of interesting that they now look out the door at something that some of them consider offensive, right? Because it is based on...
never that. An offensive statue?
Oh, well...
Shocking.
So the point is, I think, art has the power to transform.
Yes.
And the power to help us see things a little
Expand
differently.
the narrative.
Expanding the narrative.
And I'm going to say, for the folks who are listening who are not watching, it may not be obvious, but I do find it relevant that you are a beautiful African-American woman who is running this institution, that you would not be the usual suspect that anyone would assume would be running the institution. And I think that part of the success of expanding the narrative and helping folks on all sides of these conversations find themselves and extend their hearts to the other and just go to new places. I think that your who you are, your intelligence, your experience has contributed to that in a significant way.
Well, I mean, I'm a huge believer in intersectionality.
Yeah.
And always have. We just now have language to say that.
Yes.
Right? So, yeah, I mean, when I walked in the door in 2008, that was a story, right? And for three good reasons.
Right.
I shouldn't say good reasons, 3 reasons that kept popping up. I was not known in the Civil War community at all. It was not my area of study or my area of work. So there was concern about that. Even though, I had this extraordinary career and success running museums and helping do turnaround situations and so forth and so on. The fact that I was a woman put me in a very, very narrow field. In fact, only 4% out of the 35,000 museums in the country,
Wow.
only 4% are run by women of color or women of color in leadership roles. And when it comes to history museums, that number is even smaller.
Wow.
And so, so that was the other part of this. And then, yeah, so, and then the black part.
That little old thing.
So right away, there were those who were like, well, she's black. There's no way she's ever going to be, fair to our story. Which, I'm like, seriously? I mean, it was kind of tired.
Yeah.
But the thing is, that's the problem. This isn't just your story.
No.
It belongs to all of us. The problem is how we've been telling it. And so what I'm hoping to do, and what I had hoped to do, and what I was explaining to people was, my desire is to bring us all back to understanding all of these pieces of this story. You cannot begin to understand how the Confederacy is able to sustain itself for 4 years. Yes, they absolutely had brilliant military leaders, many of whom, resigned their commissions from the United States government to do what they did. But it was also because, and principally because, they could reserve fighting to white men. Black folk served as camp slaves, so all that behind-the-scenes work, all that cooking, cleaning, hauling equipment, etc., was done by camp slaves. And there are some folks who have recently tried to say, well, those were, black Confederate soldiers. Nonsense. The government was very clear that they were not going to do that, and it was not until the final days of the war that they even passed any, when they knew they were losing. They didn't have any other option. Almost 40, well, yeah, I mean, out of a population of 9 million in the American South, 4 million are enslaved people. So you can't separate what's happening here. They're continuing to, the forced labor is continuing on these farms and plantations to continue the wealth and to be able to supply this army. But as that starts to break down and folks are running away, because 1 million black folks will run away in the chaos of the war, some of them will join the United States to provide those services and to fight. Native Americans, 20 different Native nations will choose a side in the American Civil War. Out of that 20, 16 will align with the United States despite repeated treaty violations.
Wow.
Because they are opposed to the institution of slavery. 4 will align with the Confederacy because they are heavily engaged in the trade with the South. Meanwhile, Mexicans, for whom the border had crossed them less than 20 years prior, who, when they gained their independence, struck down the institution of African slavery, are now helping runaways cross the Rio Grande into Mexico for freedom. I mean, all of this is impacting, and we never hear the story that way. Meanwhile, as, for example, in Vicksburg, when the United States Army in 1863 is really trying to crush, they are trying to crush the morale of the South. They are starving people deliberately. They are bombarding the city. The people who survived that, no, they don't forget. They pass that on to their children. So they are angry. They're passing that anger. They're passing that trauma. I get that. So it's, but you cannot blame that on a false premise of why folks did what they did. You see what I'm saying? And so for me, all of this became, I had to learn it. I had to learn it, I had to digest it, I had to become a part of it. And like I said, in those first couple years when you're trying to, get the lay of the land,
Bearings, yeah.
get your bearings. I often use that as a humor point when they say, and now, the president, and I walk out and I go, get a load of me, wasn't expecting that, right? And people would laugh and it would put them at ease, and then we could talk.
Yeah.
So
So we're about
I'm
to
sorry.
wrap up. No, please don't be sorry. This has been amazing. I'm thinking we happen to have a guest in the studio, a young woman, a young African American woman who's watching, and it makes me think about, we have a situation in our communities where there are so many opportunities to engage, to give back, to change the narrative, to expand our understanding, that our kids don't even know about. There are careers and fields that we just don't even have access to. So what would you say to a young person who would like to contribute to expanding the narrative similarly to you? Like, what would be the path for a young person?
I would say when you get an assignment in class, and this is going to take a little work, and my parents used to make me do this, right?
Yeah.
So when you get an assignment, whether it's an English class or history class or whatever, so, and you had to write that report, well, don't write about the person that's already in the book. Find somebody else.
Ooh.
Or tell a story about that person that you didn't know. So Harriet Tubman is a perfect example. She's kind of been, her story's kind of been whitewashed, the runaway who helped free the slaves, and she did this, and she did abolitionist, da-da-da. That's great. Most people didn't know that she also is one of the only women to lead a military campaign.
That's right.
Down in the Combahee River. She's got a battalion of soldiers behind her to go down there, break up some mines, knows where the mines are, using her networks, and frees like 700 people just in that exchange, right? Most people don't know that story, or that she was a nurse or a spy or all the other things.
No.
And so just find that point, find that for yourself. One of the things that absolutely makes me nuts is when I hear people say, well, I never learned that in school.
Oh, gosh.
I'm like, well, pick up a book.
This was me last night trying to talk to some folks, mixed company.
Yeah,
and somebody
I was like,
mentioned Emmett Till and mentioned
Oh, my
Medgar
God.
Evers, and they had no idea who they were, and I'm just
Oh,
like,
and that just makes my head hurt. And so, but then there is in the role another opportunity, right? So one of the things that recently is that I've been appointed for the state's African American Commission, which is aligned with trying to determine what are the things that we should have in Virginia's curriculum.
oh, amen.
And so I'll be involved in that.
Yes.
Oh, congratulations.
Yes.
Yeah, that's going to be really wonderful. There's some great people on that.
Good.
Great people on
It's
that
a huge
group.
missing piece. Like
Yeah,
what we are
absolutely.
not telling our children, and what we're
Cassandra
not
Libby
exposing
Alexander,
to.
Julian
Goodness.
Hayter. I mean, there's just all these amazing, Dr. Robert C. Watson.
Nice.
There's just an amazing group of people who will be,
That's great.
adding to this. And then probably the most harmful of all, that even black people, unfortunately, too many of us anyway, have kind of subconsciously fallen into the idea that Africa was nothing. That there's no culture, or that we don't have an extension of culture, and all of that, which is really unfortunate of what a masterful job. Look, if Africa was that bad, they would have never wanted anything out of there, right? It's the most rich and diverse continent on the planet, and it's reflected in the people. And those people who have been subjected to colonialism and imperialism and having their resources snatched, and when they claimed independence, those resources were completely snatched from underneath of them, that kept them poor and kept, this ongoing waging of war, and it's just horrible. And so, I say we got to talk about that. If we're talking about conditions in England prior to settlement, then why aren't we talking about conditions on the continent of Africa, and Western Africa particularly? We know where these people came from. We know, those first Africans, whether they were arriving in the Spanish territory or whether they were arriving in English or French territory. We know where they came from.
That's right.
Why aren't we talking about what they bring that will also be a part of and become a very rich part of American culture?
So young people out there, there's a project for you. We
There's a
need some
project.
young folks to get on that narrative.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I'm hoping that there are some young people who are watching this podcast that will inbox us, and maybe we can help play a role in contributing to getting them to your museum.
That would be fantastic.
I actually, by the way, I shared the same thing with Bill. I work with about 400 or 500 people suffering with severe mental illness, and one of the best things with these people to help like rehabilitate these people is that when you take them to museums and places, it reminds them of a time in their life when they were aware of maybe what they're looking at or just in school and learning. And so I'm looking to hopefully follow up with you so I can schedule some field trips for
That
our
would be great.
for our special
That would be
folks.
great.
It's been a pleasure to have you.
It's
Thank
been
you
a
very
pleasure.
much.
And I'm sorry if I was a little too talky. You didn't
No.
get the
That's what it's all
Why
about.
did I invite you? To sit quietly?
No. That's really what it's all about. You are here to inform,
Yes.
educate,
Thank
and bring awareness to people about your museum, for them to learn more about you and your career. And you get the 2019 Do-Gooder Award from Randy Wilson and Dr. Jana. I mean,
like that.
just to add in there with all your other accolades. But thank you, Ms. Coleman. Thank you again, Dr. Jana. Great suggestion of a guest. This has been episode 21, season 2 of the Randy Wilson podcast. Please make sure that you tune in and subscribe. Please make sure you go check out the Civil War Museum and knock on the door to ask to speak with Ms. Coleman. She'll be busy, but make yourself known. Thank you.
Thank you both so much.
Thank you.